let's try it again. It's that lunchtime vibe. So you know we're going to need some energy here. Good afternoon. All right, that's more like it. I have the great honor of being in conversation with Dr. Tequilla Brownie and Aylon Samouha as we really talk about intentional cross-collaboration and what that means in deep engagement and partnership with students and families and communities. And so I'm so eager to learn with and from them. And so with that, I'm gonna do just some very quick introductions so that we can get into the conversation because our time is limited. So I'll just ask that you bear with me because I wanna make sure I do justice and honor to their leadership and to their work. I am thrilled to introduce Aylon. He is the CEO and co-founder of Transcend, a nonprofit that partners with school communities to design and spread innovative learning environments so all young people can thrive. I've known Aylon for quite some time, and so with over 20 years of experience, he has been driving education innovation with his team, working shoulder to shoulder with so many schools to design innovation solutions and models for today's learners. And so thank you, Aylon, for being here and for sharing your insight. And Dr. Tequilla Brownie, she is the CEO of TNTP. I have read so many of the white papers from TNTP, and so it's a real honor. Under her leadership, TNTP partners with 4,000 systems in 41 states, unlocking economic and social mobility for all young people. And so thank you for also allowing us to learn. And so over the time, actually, not just being here, my bus rides, the last 24 hours, literally, I have been in conversation where people have been talking about we are at a moment in time when people are stepping back from education. They're stepping back from education, they're questioning whether progress still remains, whether that is still possible. And so then I get to be on the stage with the two of you all, two people that I know have continued in this work. Not only have you continued, you've deepened your impact in it. Like Aylon, I had the great honor of this Learning for All book where I'm like, okay, Aylon's 10 toes deep. Like, I'm all in it. Tequilla, I got to see some of the work of your team in terms of putting out the word, in terms of what the data says and what that means about scaling impact. Tell me what continues to drive you to stay in it when everyone in the conversation is saying, I don't know. Aylon, let's start with you.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks for being our moderator. It's so good to be here with both of you. So for me, I'm a parent of a 13-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl. And like so many parents, when I say, how's school today? I get, what do I get? Okay. Fine. Right, exactly. And we know what that means, right? At best, it means it was a mediocre day. And at worst, it means actually, something that was harmful or painful. And we spend 15,000 hours in school from K to 12. And that's a lot of time of human potential, of the possibility for human flourishing, where for me as a parent of 2 children, and for us as a society with, billions of kids, but 75 million in this country, that's just not good enough. It's not good enough for every kid, and I think as we're seeing today in society, it's certainly not good enough for society. And so that's what keeps me going every day is I don't think we have a choice. Any of the issues we care about, from democracy to the environment to equity, et cetera, cannot be solved without education being at the center.
Thank you first for having me here as well, and I'd name sort of 2 bookends for me. One is my own lived experience. I grew up in the Deep South in the Delta, in a house without even indoor plumbing. Yes, in this great United States of America. I chopped cotton as a child, and no, I'm not 100. This was truth in the Deep South. Education literally shifted the very trajectory of my life. As we commit to and we promise that education is that great equalizer. So that was my story. Fast forward, many of you are familiar with TNTP's report, The Opportunity Myth, where we tracked students all around the country and we looked at what was their experience and how were they experiencing school. So we went back to some of those students recently to just find out, hey, how are you doing? What do you think? One particular student that we highlighted in our recent paper, The Paths of Opportunity, Noe, actually told us that Noe was actually gifted in math. Nobody knew it. Here was a child who had aspirations to actually work for Citigroup. No one even knew he was in math until a teacher finally noticed, said, hey, you should take an AP math course. He did, was successful. Not only did he finish high school, he went on to college, graduated from college, and after, I don't know, double-digit attempts, finally got an entry-level job with Citigroup. He now is a homeowner, thriving, saving, caring for his family. But when I think about what could have been my end, when I think about what could have been and almost was Noe's end, that is unacceptable. If what we purport, that education is that great equalizer, that's why I cannot give up. Our children's lives, and therefore our very own, actually depends on it.
Oh, thank you for saying that, especially the piece around our very own lives depends on the future of our children. Thank you for talking about asking your children. I have a 6-year-old, and so every day is good. And I'm like, I don't know what that means. Give me a little bit more. And Aylon has had the privilege of being around me with my child and helping me ask the right questions so that you can get to the source of what's happening with kids, because they have all of the answers. They have the thoughts about what's working and what's not working, and they are the future. We are bound to them and by them, so thank you for that.
Whitney Houston told us. The children are our future.
They are our future. They are our future. Okay, so let's level set, because there is so much information that's out there in terms of the current state of affairs in education, in terms of what the data says. We've had the pandemic. Bring us into, because I just think it's so important when we're talking about, so what do you do, to first start with where are we, and are we all seeing the same thing and interpreting it the same way? So I'd love to just hear you talk a little bit about how you make meaning of where we are right now.
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say, we saw our recent NAEP results right in the fall. The one thing I just have to start this conversation is to remind us all why Congress authorized NAEP in the first place. They didn't authorize NAEP to say, oh, here is a point-in-time measure of where our children are, and if they're not doing well, let's give up on them. They said, let's measure, let's monitor, and then let's actually innovate and improve through policies and strategies. And so while, yes, what we see in the data is absolutely not acceptable, even some of the places, and they should be celebrated, that made gains that were pre-COVID, there was actually an article in the New York Times, I think maybe today or yesterday. Anybody see that? If you looked at where the sort of downward trend started, it was 2013. You all saw that, some of you have seen that article, which tells us that something has been broken for a while with our education system. Now, do we divest? Absolutely not. What we do is actually, yes, you have this data. We have to really use it surgically, right, to understand, and from a diagnostic perspective, just like if one went to the emergency room, who just wants a random antibiotic off the shelf? Hello? Right? And so we can't do that with our kids. We have to understand what they need and then treat it accordingly. And yes, absolutely progress monitor and improve along the way. So the level set, I would say, is getting back to COVID is where we were before COVID. That is a good, big, important step. The downward trend, we had made progress. Contrary to what everyone is sort of saying right now, the 40 years of education reform since A Nation at Risk, we actually were making steady progress, particularly for some of our most vulnerable students. Now, COVID did send the achievement gap backwards 30 years. We got work to do.
Thank you for providing that context. And what I'll say with that backdrop is that I'm seeing a engagement crisis in schools that I think correlates to the same timeline that you just shared, where there's so many ways of looking at it, but let's just, from a learning science perspective, look at it for a moment and say, learning happens when there's engagement, and no learning has ever happened without it. And so in the very least, engagement is a precursor for learning. And the data that we see is disappointing. you know, look at it from a few different angles. Chronic absenteeism is the highest it's been in a long time. 1 in 4 kids was chronically absent from school last year. When you ask kids, what about school? Let's see, I'll give you a couple of my unfortunate favorites. 2 out of 10 say they love school. 3 out of 10 basically say it's a waste of time. You ask kids, do you love school? In 3rd grade, 75% say they love school. By 10th grade, 25% say they love school. We give a LEAP survey, which is our kind of the experience survey that we give at Transcend. We've given it to about 70,000 kids. We will consistently get things like 20% of kids saying the learning is relevant to them, 20 or 30% saying they feel like they're in charge of their learning. The list goes on. And to me, what was true in 2013 and what's still true today is that school was not designed to maximize engagement. It was designed 100 years ago to prepare kids for farm and factory work. It was meant to be rote. It was meant to have unequal expectations for different kids. And to the extent we had progress over the last few decades, we were changing some of that. We were actually saying we have high expectations for all kids. That's not how school was designed originally, right? The part of the reason why I'm leaning into this is because I think there's more we can do to increase engagement. And when we see schools really prioritize that, you see changes almost immediately. I've seen 20% of kids saying relevant to 80% saying kids learning was relevant in a matter of weeks. It is so possible. They want to be engaged, right? I'll say one last thing, which is I play a game sometimes with Uber because I'm going to airports a lot, just like both of you. And they'll ask me what I do. We talk, and then I'll say, well, so do you love learning? And they're like, I love learning. I'm like, tell me about a time where you were wildly engaged to learn. They tell me a story. I'm like, tell me one about in school that happening, because it's never a story about school, and they can't tell me, right? And when I look at my own life, I think it's the same way. This place where we spend 15,000 hours should be the place where I'm wildly motivated, wildly engaged to learn, and it's not designed to do that.
Aylon, you said something, you've been using the word engagement. And in reading your book, I see so many different examples of what that means. So I know there's no one answer to that, but in order to ensure that everyone here understands what you mean when you say engagement, can you give a little flavor of like, what does engagement mean to you in the like layman terms, in terms of make it accessible to everyone?
Yeah, so first I'll say, I think we all know what it is when we feel it. Right? We're in flow. We want to learn the next thing. We lose track of time, right? For me, it's jazz guitar, where I could be playing something for like 2 hours, and I look up, I'm like, oh my, I have to go to bed. I can't believe how long I've been doing this for. So I will say, I think we all know when we see it and when we're experiencing it. And there's a lot of ways of defining it, but one way that I found helpful is, what are the drivers of that state of flow, et cetera? And both the science, but also when we talk to kids and teachers, what we learn is that it's one part intellectual engagement, like there's something to solve, there's something difficult, right? Something cool, so like it gets the brain working. One that's paired with some level of empowerment, some level of agency. I get to decide something about this. You get another level, right? So it's not just that it's hard, but I get to be in charge of it. And when both those things are true, and I feel a sense of connection and community with others, where I feel a sense of belonging, or my identity is affirmed or built, and I don't have the stereotype threat, but quite the opposite. I have I'm supposed to be here, right? And I feel connected. When you've got all that happening, you get to those levels of engagement that I think we've all felt before and seen, in our own kids or in classrooms, et cetera.
Thank you, Aylon. Tequilla, you mentioned something around, we have this report. It makes it clear to data that this is unacceptable in terms of like what should be available to all students and all learners. And at the same time, sometimes a story can be painted that no progress has been made. And so you started to mention this fact that progress has been made. Can you help us see through your eyes, what's the progress that you see that has been made for the rest of the team?
Sure. I mean, two different reports I'll highlight quickly here. So in paths of opportunity, think about Chetty's work. Chetty has done a lot of great work in measuring economic and social mobility. And so we decided as an organization, you know, at TNTP, we sit at that intersection of research, policy, and implementation, right, practice. And so we said it's good to know that information. Now what are you going to do about it, right, beyond just measuring? And so we dug in looking at the actual academic data through the National Study Survey of Longitudinal Survey of Youth. And in that, what we found is that for high school students who experience poverty at any point in their lives, on average, they had about a 31% chance of getting to a living wage by the age of 30. And now let's all agree that is the floor, not the ceiling. Now, when they had high academic outcomes, they had access to the type of experience that Aylon is describing, that number actually doubled, right? It goes to 58%. Now, that's still a coin's toss. I want better chances than that for my 15-year-old. But guess what? If they didn't have access to a strong academic experience, that number dropped to 21%. So it tells us that access to a good educational experience, it changes the outcomes for children. And when it doesn't, it gets to that. The interesting thing, though, we found in that data, you look at just middle-class kids on average, the number was about 63%. Right, I see some surprises. That tells us our best and brightest students in high school who are working very hard still aren't as likely to get to just a living wage than a child who just was lucky enough to be born into at least a middle-income family. Again, for us, we don't stop there just measuring. So we started to dig into our own research with the 6,000, districts that we serve, looking at research all over, and we started to emerge some things. Those unicorns that made it, what was true for them? It's hiding in plain sight. Then we also looked at, hey, those middle-class kids, we all know about the high school grooming, right? We know that. So while some of us are telling kids, oh, don't go to college, we have others paying people to get in, right? I'm not supposed, okay, okay. So, but my point is, when you look at that, 4 other things besides academics emerge. Academics, foundational, it's a non-starter. Kids will not be economically mobile if they are illiterate or don't have numeracy. But what else we found? Social capital, access to networks. What we also found, early exposure and intentionality around career-connected learning. You talk about engagement, you ask a 5-year-old what they want to be, they don't look at you like you're speaking a foreign language. They play back whatever they've been exposed to. We actually can and should do that work much earlier. My 15-year-old, I love him. He left my front door open last night, and I'm in San Diego. Now, do you think that boy is going to be ready for somebody's apprenticeship tomorrow, right, when he turns 16? And so my point is, you have to start early there are a lot of people divesting from K-12 right now, as if our kids are going to wake up magically ready for apprenticeships when they're reading on a 2nd grade level. How dare us? The 4th one is personal support. Now, I had an advisor in college who helped me navigate and figure out what I wanted to do. If we know that college students need that type of mapping and guiding, why on earth do we leave it to chance for our younger children to do that? So within K-12, we need that. And the last one is civic and community engagement. If you look at all the survey data for this generation, they're passionate, they're motivated about our world. They're seeking purpose. We have to harness that. So I think to what Aylon is getting at with the engagement, those 5 factors to me, I was a psych major. Any psych majors in the room? Yes, right? Motivational theories, right? Expectancy theory. That's how we unlock how to turn on that engagement. We talk about wanting kids to be intrinsically motivated. I actually think there's a way to that, and it's the types of things that Aylon has written about and what we're finding in our work with our young people.
Okay, I'm going to eventually come back to you because I want to hear from you. Like, where do you start? Like, how do you get started? It's like, okay, so I'm not there.
I have an opinion on that.
Yeah, how do you get started? But Aylon, I'm going to have you join in because a lot of the work that you do is like the school partnerships, helping people redesign how to even think about engagement and hearing from the students and being the bedrock of how work is done. Can you bring us into what you see as some best practices, some good thoughts that should give us hopefulness for the possibilities ahead? Yeah, I'm going to have you start there, and then I'm going to come back to you, Tequilla, because I want to definitely hear about that piece.
So our answer to this question starts with a process of students, families, educators, other experts, what we call the community, but broadly, coming together to interrogate what does school need to be? What's the purpose of it? What do our young people need? Where are we at today? Let's look at the mirror. Let's look at what the future demands. Let's look at what the science says. Let's look at what other inspiring things are happening elsewhere. And we have found that when folks go through processes like these, they very quickly discover what's going on with their kids, and they build both the conditions for change, which would be the coalition, the shared conviction, the clarity about what the change takes, but also they start to imagine a different kind of design. When they can bring ideas from other places, because one thing that we do in education that we don't do in other sectors is we ask people to be both on the front line and be the inventors of the future at the same time, right? It would be like asking a doctor who's serving patients to also come up with a vaccine in the same week, right? And so we're not trying to put educators in that position. I remember when I started in this work, about a decade ago, maybe a lot longer than that. Shoo.
I know,
but
like,
just on the
Aylon,
information
tell the
time, I know we
truth,
won't.
you're
I
not
know.
20.
I know. I used to have. We were talking about personalization, right? And I remember coming to conferences like this, and it felt like what we were saying was, if you give a teacher $50,000 and a set of iPads, they'll reinvent school. And I think we've gotten more sophisticated since then, but I'm not sure if we've completely pivoted from that conception. And so what we've seen is when communities go on these journeys and can implement evidence-based practices that are packaged and codified, but then that they can implement in their own context, make it their own, build their own local evidence, right? Stitch it together cohesively with other ideas that are already present or that also they're importing from other places, that we start to see real difference. For example, the Brooklyn Steam Center in New York took the best of, I would say, CTE practices from around the country, the best of mentorship and internship practices, the best of goal setting and some of the, getting yourself in charge and in the driver's seat practices from actually not even in education. We stitch those together, and today there are hundreds of 11th and 12th graders in New York. They come from 8 high schools in New York public DOE that go to the Brooklyn Steam Center for half the day during 11th and 12th grade for 2 years, getting certification in design, technology, construction, and these are real credentials that they get real jobs with, and even when they go to college, because a lot of them go to college, they're making money while they're going to college, right, and setting themselves up, and all the things are happening, right? They're intellectually engaged, they are connected to the community, to each other, to industry professionals that serve as mentors, and they feel like they're in charge, right, because they are. And so those kinds of things, what I'm seeing in rural communities, right, where some of the conditions are so rich, as you know, right, because it's small, right? The superintendent is in the grocery store with the parent and the kids, right? We've seen in the course of a year, students go from, it brought tears to my eyes when I heard it, this young lady in Clear Creek, Colorado, a small rural community. She was part of one of these processes where they decided together, ironically, the creek of Clear Creek was not clear, and so they decided, we need to figure out how to clean this creek. And they learned a lot of science, and the quote that I'll never forget that she said to a bunch of us was, I used to feel like I didn't have value. I used to feel worthless. And now I know I have a purpose, right? And when I see that, and it's not just by luck and there happened to be a good teacher, but a very intentional process of interrogating what does our community need, but not leaving it, not saying and just go figure it out on your own, but providing some of those answers along the way, magic happens.
Tequilla, so you gave me the principles, right? You were talking about civic engagement, like the belief that we have to have in our students and our children. Tell me a little bit about someone says, right, this is where I am. I'm not even sure how to get there. You said you had some thoughts for us on like what to do now to get started.
Yes, I'm going to take us back a little bit in the opportunity myth. Two big findings from that report that we talked about. Within the walls of the school system, what needed to be true? And we identified those 4 resources: high quality instructional materials, rigorous instruction, student engagement, and access to educators who had high expectations. High expectations is free, am I right?
Right. Well,
Okay, so that was the first one. The other side of that coin that a lot of folks didn't pay attention to, but that we dug into at TNTP was authentic community engagement. Because one of the things that's been happening is we put on the backs of education the things that as a nation we're kind of too cowardly to deal with as a whole. And so now even the wars that we're seeing play out in all of our educational institutions, they're representative of broader societal problems. And so when we try to help our schools focus on what they're supposed to do, which is provide our young people with a solid academic experience, we decided to dig in and say, okay, yes, here were those 4 resources. How do you bring that to life? And so one of the problems, a crisis, I should say, facing our nation right now is the number of students that are behind grade level. Now, I've been in debates, folks, about like, oh, we got to add a 13th year or 14th year. I'm like, we can't get kids to stay 12 years right now, so good luck with that. Like, that can't necessarily be the answer. We went through the data as an org and found a handful of schools who had at least a 10-year history of helping kids get back on grade level. And so we said, well, that's key right there, because again, how do you convince a young person to try? So we dug in deep, both quantitative and qualitative. What were those schools doing? 3 big findings came out of that report: opportunity makers. Those schools are making opportunities for kids. You caught that, right? Okay, just checking. Consistency, coherence, and belonging. Wow. Consistency, that means you're stacking good days. It's not that 2 days out of the week that kid has access to what those 4 resources, they consistently did. That coherence, they're not learning about some random acts of something in intervention and then something totally different and disconnected in their tier 1 instruction. There's coherence, let alone what's happening in out of school time. And then that sense of belonging. Mm-hmm. Kids actually feel seen and heard, and they feel like they belong in that school. Those 3 things, those were the themes. It's in the data, right? Kind of unassailable. The schools that were doing those 3 things are the ones that were getting kids back on track and have a consistent pattern of doing so. So if I were to say where to start at that school level, schools should look at those practices. We lay them out, they're on our website, open resource, yes, you're welcome, but resources that schools can start implementing now to begin to help kids get back on grade level so that we can, that's the floor, getting on grade level. Can we agree to that? Yeah. Being on grade level is the floor, that is not the North Star. Helping kids get back on grade level and then making it be true that more than that 58% of kids from poverty, that coin toss, can get to at least, my God, a living wage by the age of 30. That's what we have our sights set on at TNTP.
Wow, thank you for that. And Aylon, you talked about the example from the community, right? Like we're there, how you're going to clean this thing up. You have a small group of people where you're engaging deeply. You allow them to lead, but you help them see the answers within themselves while giving them a support system. Some might say, that sounds really good, but that's like a small population. Like, how do you do that at scale? Do you have any thoughts about how we think about translating that to transform a broader ecosystem?
Yes, thanks for asking that. And I just want to add a couple things to what Tequilla said. In support of it. One is when we're seeing the same thing, that right, like where yes we are, right, and actually what's really like we did this because we happened to be in conversation and literally discovered, oh my God, we're literally saying the same things. We have to talk about this together. So that's the origin story. Okay, but one of those things is that when those experiences are changing that you just pointed to, we're seeing grade point averages increase. We're seeing test scores increase. We're seeing absenteeism go down. I mean, it is, and we're looking at different data and coming to the same conclusions, right? So just wanted to, really put an exclamation point on that. And then the other thing is that consistency and coherence and belonging that you're talking about, that is the objective of the design, right? That those places that you're talking about, whether they called it design or not, they have built something that is different than that, and that's why we're seeing that exceptional data, right? Like, they're not just doing the same old design, but executing it a little bit better. No, they're actually making different design choices and executing it better, right? And so then the question is, how do we bring that to scale, right? And one thing that we've seen is that, we've been in this for a long time, all of us have, and there was a moment, I think, where we believed that, kind of, if you build it, they will come, right? That, the thing that Boston really needed was a couple of really good charter schools that would show the way, and then Boston Public Schools would learn, and they would just adopt it, and we would be at the promised land. And that wasn't a terrible theory. I mean, like, that's a good, it just didn't actually happen, right? And I think when we go underneath, like, why didn't it happen, is it's just not as simple as going and visiting a thing and saying, I want to do that. And that theory, I've come to understand, and I'm one of the people that, I ran charter schools myself, like, where it was a very, like, top-down theory. That it's like, we just need to have the answer, and then we need to put the answer on top of the community, and they will do it, just like, a shipment of, antibiotics, to build on your analogy, right? And so the question of, there's not an easy answer to the scale question that sounds like put it in a box and give it to people, which is why what we have to ask ourselves is, how do we scale a process by which community by community? And as you said, that sounds exhausting. And sometimes when I'm talking to, folks about this, including funders, they're like, really? There's 130,000 schools in this country. And 13,000 districts. How's this going to happen, right? And the thing that's giving us faith is that while the build it, they will come theory doesn't work, what does work is building a sense of inspiration within a community and then very intentionally spreading those practices within it, right? So as an example, in Aldine, Texas, we've helped implement one of these models that builds belonging, et cetera, with the help of lots of people. It actually originated in DC, in a DC public school. It's called the Whole Child Model. We've helped spread that to 10 schools in Aldine, Texas, and we're seeing all those numbers go up like we talked about. But here's the magical thing that's happened. Now that we've done that, they're doing some community-based processes on high schools to move to CTE models. And they're thinking about, how do we do this for math, right? It has sparked a thing within the entire district where they're asking themselves, how do we build the capacity to be changing the way we do school forever? Well, we're not just trying to replace a 100-year model of school with a new 100-year model of school, but we're replacing it with something that's dynamic, ever learning, ever responsive to new needs, ever resourceful with new technologies, right? And that's how other sectors run. And so that's a question we're asking ourselves. How do we scale that? And it takes very deliberate action, building proof points, building the capacity in a local community. But we're starting to see it happen. And so, let's have this panel again in 5 years, and hopefully I'll have some whole district examples of this.
Well, to come to that point, sort of your question about how to scale, I would argue there's a little bit of it also hiding in plain sight. So I was one of those 15 million rural kids in the country, right? The town I grew up in had 700 people. My town didn't have they'll still exist. My town didn't have a hospital, but you know what my town had? A school. So if we think about not just the physical building for a moment, let's think about the institution of education and the power that it could have in a community. A couple of examples how that's playing out for us. We believe that to whom much is given, much is required. And so when we look at those 4,000 districts that we're partnering with now, That's trust. They don't call us in because it's a sunny day. They call us because they need help, and they trust that we can actually help them. So we at TNTP have been thinking about how do we use those partnerships that we already have all across this great nation to be a catalyst for some of this work. Two examples that I'll share where we're already seeing that play out. One is some of our work in Phoenix. We're trying to work to help parents be engaged, Latinx parents. And so what happened with that work, not only did they become more engaged and feel like they could be empowered to advocate for their children, they then themselves lined up to become educators themselves. So it turned into this like pipeline program. We're like, well, we didn't expect that, but that's where you authentically engage the community. Those are called 2-gen, multi-gen strategies. Why? We know those are all effective. A different example, we actually have been working in Grand Rapids. Please don't go to Grand Rapids in December or January, just FYI. So we've been working there, partnering with the community and General Motors, trying to help them. They wanted to know, how can we really work with the district around STEM? Well, you know the beautiful part? We didn't go into a corner with the district, go into a separate corner with GM. We actually brought together the community to map out what was the landscape, their context, right? What was their market, and then align their programming around STEM to align with the local job market that their kids would be accessing. Birmingham, we've been on the ground now there for, I don't know, 5, 7 years, right? Birmingham, before COVID, said, they came together and said, our number one problem that we're worried about for our children, it was mental health. Now, some of the funders didn't like that. They're like, well, no, we want to fund you to do some math or literacy work. The community said, we're worried about mental health, and this was pre-COVID. We worked with that community, helped them secure funding. They stood up their own organization that is a cross-collaborative table, Empower Ed. You know what Birmingham recently got? And that same group is helping lead Good Jobs Birmingham now, right? They're experiencing phenomenal growth, and the community is at the center, and I would like to think that we played a part simply by setting the table, helping do the translation, right? We know in K-12 we talk standards and grades, and in workforce we talk skills and jobs. Do the translation, help people find common ground, what is our highest aspiration for our young people, and help figure out what role we each can play to get towards that.
Common ground, connection, community, partnership, deep engagement. I'm getting all the tenors of that. Like the recipe is actually within the community. And that what we do is like we help play a part in that partnership and integration to make sure it's relevant to them. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, we have a few minutes left. In this room, we have a community of educators, entrepreneurs, funders, different stakeholders, policymakers, and the likes. I'm going to end where I started off with this question of, in a moment in time, in an external climate, where folks are really asking the question, is it possible to still make progress? Why still stay in this? Why still commit to this? We have been well over generations trying. What would you say to our partners, our friends who are out here who are maybe just saying, like, I don't know, like, should I still keep giving in at this moment in time? What is the charge that you have to this audience and to the group of people who are listening on the video, outside, who are going to come back to this in the moment in time where they really need to have some sense of hope of why now and why still? What would you offer?
I would say two things. Number one, please resist the call to back into our corners and not be able to hold two things true. Because it is actually true that we had been making progress steadily up until about 2013. It is also true that we need to do even more, and we must do even more to continue to innovate and invest in our young people. Now is not the time to divest from our young people. It is also true that I believe that our education system's connection to the very American ideal, it's broken. That's why our children aren't engaged, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so the call that I would say is, I did a podcast this morning with Tiffany and Dr. Grant from Harvard, and we talked about research, rigor, and relevance. Those three things must go together. We must continue to innovate to find ways to help our children not just catch up, but accomplish everything that they aspire. And so when we put together that innovation, that research, rigor, and relevance, along with our moral compass and our moral aspiration as a nation, then I would just ask, how dare we even attempt to not to give up on our young people?
Yes, amen.
Yes.
I'll say two things. One is to build on the don't go into our corners. I think we need to also resist the politicization of schools and classrooms. You know, the divisiveness in our country is going in all sorts of directions. And it's so sad to see it in the school, right? And so some of the very understandable impulses to shut down, to not be in dialogue, are going to hurt us. And so I think that's probably a call that's even broader than just for schools, but it certainly applies. And if I were to pick just one group to talk to more, it's students. You know, a lot of times when we're working with schools, we will do just a very common practice of conduct an interview with a student for 45 minutes. There's a whole set of questions, and you only talk for 3 of the minutes. They talk for 42 of the minutes. And without exception, I've literally never talked to an educator and said, how was that? Where they haven't said 2 things. 1, I've never done that before. And 2, that was one of the most impactful things I've ever done, right? Let alone when that educator then goes and spends a day shadowing a child for an entire day. If you haven't done it, try it. And when you do that, even 2 or 3 times, let alone a dozen times, it's impossible not to believe what you said, right? That we cannot divest, right? Because our brains immediately understand that these children represent all children. They represent our children. And so that's maybe my biggest call to action is talk to the kids.
Talk to the kids. Talk to the kids. Center community. Center student voices, their perspectives, their experience. Thank you. Tequilla, Aylon, thank you for sharing your insights. And as they shared, the time continues, the time is now. Have a great day, you all.